The story of William the Marshal reads like a legend from Camelot, King Arthur's legendary court. It's every bit as spectacular as any one of the stories of Sir Lancelot or Sir Tristan, and it has everything you'd expect from a perfect knightly story. It has battles, tournaments, crusades, Templar knights, and even a scandal with a princess. But what is amazing about the life of this particular knight is that it isn't a legend. Everything here actually happened, and it reads like a highlights reel of all the best parts of the High Middle Ages. You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is a special bonus episode on the life of Sir William Marshal, the flower of chivalry. Our story begins in a period known as the anarchy, a period of time in English history when some people say God and the angels forgot about England. It was horrifying, but let's back up just a moment. England had already gone through an incredibly tumultuous period. In 1066, a guy called William the Conqueror led an army of Normans from Normandy, in what is now France, across the English Channel into England and invaded. William the Conqueror became the new King of England, and this was a period of radical change for England as a nation. The Normans were actually Northmen, Norsemen, otherwise known as Vikings, who had settled in France several generations earlier. And when they arrive in England, they're very different from the native population. They now speak French, for example. And so when William the Conqueror and his boys take control of England, now the court is a Norman French-speaking court. There's a new set of nobles. There's a new set of men who are in charge of the state and how it's going to run. So there's already been this absolutely shocking shift in English politics quite recently. So William the Conqueror eventually dies. His son takes over, and when this king is about to die, he leaves the throne to his daughter, because he has no surviving sons. And that daughter's name is Matilda. So she's the granddaughter of William the Conqueror, and the Normans have only been in England a couple of generations. And at this point, things get really very messy, because Matilda's cousin, a guy called Stephen, rushes in and seizes the throne of England for himself. And this leaves Matilda in a position where she's going to have to fight her cousin to stake her own claim to the throne, which was hers by right of inheritance. This makes things very difficult for all the nobles in England at the time, because they now have to take sides. They have to decide, who are they going to support? Are they going to be loyal to Stephen, who's currently wearing the crown and occupying the throne? Or are they going to side with Matilda, the daughter of their former king? And many of these nobles shift their loyalty over time as this very difficult struggle, this period called the anarchy, takes over in England and lasts about 15 years. The hero of our story, William, is born around 1146 or 1147 to a knight called John the Marshal. And John initially supported Stephen and then switched his loyalty to supporting Matilda. So he's now in the Matilda camp. William is going to be a son of his father's second marriage, a marriage that was entirely enabled by this anarchic period where loyalties are shifting around. And what happened was this. John the Marshal, William's father, is now supporting Matilda. As part of a peace deal, a more aristocratic family that had been supporting Stephen was going to send their daughter to marry John the Marshal, who was a Matilda supporter, and in this way that family that had formerly supported Stephen would be folded into the Matilda supporter camp. The problem was, John the Marshal was already married. So he put away his wife in medieval terms. He basically retired her. He sent her off to a nunnery, he dismissed her, and that left him ready and able to make this second marriage, which was very important for political reasons. So this second marriage of John Marshal is a perfect example of how and why marriages are being arranged amongst nobles in this period. It has nothing to do with affection, devotion, or personal preference. It has everything to do with cementing political alliances and serving priorities of people even higher up the chain than John the Marshal himself. So he's actually making a marriage to strengthen the Matilda side. It's something that benefits him in some ways, but it benefits other people at least as much. Anyway, the woman who is now John Marshal's second wife as a result of this political alliance is the mother of the hero of our story, young William. This makes William the second son of a second batch of children. And in the terms of the 12th century, the 1100s, which is when he's born, this means he's a child of not much significance. In the very feudal world of the 12th century, the oldest son would be expected to inherit his father's title, lands, and wealth. And the second, third, and fourth sons were sometimes assigned careers in the church or left to make their own way in the world. And this was more or less what was expected for William. I should pause and just give you a brief note about the word Marshal here. I've been using it like a surname, John Marshal, William Marshal. Although more properly I should say William the Marshal, because it was more of a hereditary title at this point. Originally, the office of Marshal was a man who was in charge of the king's horses, as well as logistical preparations for battles. So it was kind of a military post. And by this time, it was one that had been handed down as a hereditary title and was fast on track to being much more like a surname in terms of everyday use. And when you think about it, that's not so much different than other surnames that we know even today. Things like Smith, for example, a very common family name, which was originally a trade designation. It told you what the man's job was. And over time, it just became attached as a surname for that man and his family. So there's a similar thing going on here with William the Marshal, who I'm calling William Marshal. One of the most dramatic moments in William Marshal's childhood comes in 1152, so he's about the age of 5 or 6 when he's handed over to King Stephen as a hostage. Now, this wasn't an unusual practice. The idea of handing over hostages as a guarantee for someone keeping their word in an important agreement goes all the way back to Roman times and probably before. They're still doing it in England in the 1100s. And the situation was this. John Marshal, William's father, was in charge of a castle that was being attacked by King Stephen. Remember, John Marshal is a Matilda supporter, and Matilda is King Stephen's rival for the throne. So King Stephen is attacking this castle, and at one point they call a truce, and there is this moment of talks and negotiation. So John Marshal meets with King Stephen, and he says, okay, let me talk to Matilda. Maybe I can get her to agree that we can hand this castle over to you. You don't have to keep besieging it. Just give me a little bit of time so that I can send the appropriate messages, and maybe we can make a deal here. And King Stephen says, okay, sounds good, but how do I know you're going to keep your word? I would like a hostage as an indication of your good faith. Now, you had to hand over a high-value person as a hostage. You couldn't send the son of some farmer who worked on your land, because in the world of medieval nobles, that was a person of no significance and therefore no value in this kind of a deal. So John Marshal hands over his little son, William, 5 or 6 years old at the time. Unfortunately for William, his father John had absolutely no intention of keeping his word to the king. In fact, he used this period of truce to resupply the castle, stockpile as much food as possible, resupply everything so that that castle was prepared to withstand a renewed siege. When King Stephen realizes that he's been duped and that John Marshal hasn't kept up his end of the deal, he sends a message to that knight and says, "Have you forgotten? Your son is in my hands, and if you're going to break your word to me, your son's life is forfeit. You're going to sacrifice him." John Marshal responds with words that are shocking to modern ears. He basically sends a message back to King Stephen and says, "Do what you want with the boy. I have the hammer and the forge, the tools that are necessary to produce another son just like him, or even better. So basically, I don't care." So at this point, King Stephen is in the awkward position of deciding how to dispose of this little boy, how to kill him to punish his father for breaking his word. And there are reports that they were going to hang the boy. So a knight is sent to collect the boy from wherever they're keeping him and bring him to the gallows. And of course, this little boy hasn't the faintest idea of the danger that he's in. And so, like any other playful kindergarten child, he's skipping and he's playing and he wants to play with the weapon of the knight who's coming to escort him to his execution. And he's brought out in front of the king. And then the king's knights have a better idea, and they say, forget about hanging the boy. Why don't we put him into a catapult and send him over the walls of the fortress that his father is defending against us? The broken body of his little son will land in pieces inside that castle as a reminder of what happens when you break your word. And so they're setting up this catapult, and little William thinks, oh, this looks like fun. Can I swing on this catapult? At this point, it all became too much for King Stephen, who couldn't quite manage the idea of taking this innocent, playful little child and throwing his life away. And so King Stephen takes the boy back to his tent, the execution has been cancelled, and he spends the rest of the siege playing games with little William. The question still haunts me. Did his father, John, really care not at all for his son's life? Is it possible that Sir John thought the king wouldn't go through with the killing? Or was he truly as cavalier about it as he made out? One theory is that at this point, in the 1100s, child mortality was so common that parents tried not to get too attached to their children, especially the ones that were very young, as William was. William wasn't the firstborn son, or even the secondborn son. He was the second son of a second marriage, and so his order of priority was fairly far down in the lines of medieval hierarchy, and perhaps his father thought that he was, in fact, dispensable. When the siege finally finished, William was eventually returned to his father, John Marshal, and the rest of his family. But not for very long, because if William was at this point 5 or 6, he only had a couple more years left before he was going to leave his birth family permanently. And this wasn't something extraordinary at all. Typically at the age of 8, sometimes even 7, boys from noble families left their homes. They said goodbye to their mothers and their sisters, and they were sent to some other foster family, there to begin the many years of training that they would need to have in order to eventually become knights. So at the age of 7 or 8, a boy entered a new home as a page boy. This was the term. And this meant he would be doing things like serving at table, helping to clean up, spending all of his time around knights and their squires, learning what would be expected of him as he got older. After about 7 years of this, when he was 14 or 15, he would graduate to being a squire. At this point, he would shift to being mostly in the company of one knight that he'd been assigned to, and as a squire, he would serve that knight individually, carrying the armor, polishing the armor, taking care of the horse, as well as undertaking horsemanship and combat training himself. And after another 7 years or so of this, if our squire passed all of his tests, then he might be knighted himself. That was the ultimate goal, although, of course, it depended a lot on the performance of the boy himself, as well as the wealth of his family. There were a significant number of young men who went through page boy training, went through squire training, but didn't actually get to the knighting ceremony because their parents didn't have the money to pay for the war horse and the armor that would be required at that point. These men served their entire lives in military roles, but they would be called sergeants and not knights, to reflect the fact that they had all the combat skills, but they hadn't actually been dubbed. They hadn't been formally knighted. So at the tender age of 8, William sets off on this well-defined path of medieval training for boys, and he's actually sent to Normandy, so mainland France, to some relatives of his father, because John Marshal, like many others in power in England at this time, comes of Norman stock, and so he sends his son back to the Norman homelands for this very important training period. William is going to grow up to be one of the foremost knights of his age. He will succeed in ways that most of his peers can only dream of. You've been listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, a special bonus episode on the life of William Marshal. If you'd like to get the rest of this story, head on over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert and become a supporter of this podcast. In addition to special bonus episodes just like this one every month, you'll get even more history content, including live conversations hosted by me.